April 19th, 1945. Stalag 7a. Moosburg, Bavaria. Oberstabsarzt Friedrich Weber stood in the prisoner of war camp's makeshift hospital watching American medics unload supply crates. The Americans had liberated the camp 3 hours earlier. Patton's Third Army had rolled through the gates at 1400 hours, and now medical teams were establishing aid stations. Weber commanded the camp's German medical staff. 32 doctors, 60 orderlies, treating 12,000 sick and wounded prisoners from a dozen nations with almost no supplies. The American medical captain walked over. His name, tape, read Morrison. He spoke German, asked Weber about patient loads and available supplies. Weber gave him an honest assessment. The camp hospital had 400 patients, pneumonia cases, infected wounds, dysentery, tuberculosis, malnutrition complications. No morphine for 6 months, no sulfa drugs since February. Bandages were being washed and reused until they disintegrated. Surgical instruments were sterilized with boiling water when fuel was available. Most medicines had been exhausted weeks ago. Morrison listened without comment. Then he gestured to the supply crates being unloaded from American trucks. He told Weber to requisition whatever was needed. Weber asked how much was available. Morrison said, "Enough. Take what you need for immediate treatment." More supplies were en route. Weber walked to the nearest crate and opened it. Inside were individual medical supply packs, each sealed in waterproof packaging. He pulled one out. The label identified it as Medical Department USA Individual Equipment. He opened the pack. Morphine syrets, sulfa powder packets, wound dressings, iodine swabs. Everything a medic needed for immediate trauma care, packaged individually, ready for use. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Weber had been a military physician since 1939. He had served in Poland, France, and Russia before his capture in 1944. He knew German military medical logistics. The Wehrmacht issued medical supplies in bulk containers that required distribution at regimental level. Individual medics carried what they could from these bulk supplies, often improvising when supplies ran short. The American system was different. Every medic carried standardized individual packs. Every soldier carried his own first aid kit. The supplies were packaged for immediate use without requiring field hospitals or distribution systems. Morrison asked Weber about specific medication needs. Weber mentioned penicillin. The camp had wounded prisoners with infected injuries, bacterial infections that would respond to penicillin if any were available. Morrison nodded and walked to another supply crate. He opened it and showed Weber the contents. Vials of penicillin, hundreds of them, each vial labeled with dosage, lot number, and manufacturing date. Weber picked up one vial. The manufacturing date read March 1945. 6 weeks old. The Americans were producing penicillin so recently that vials manufactured last month were already in Bavaria. He asked Morrison how much penicillin was available. Morrison said this crate contained approximately 500 vials, enough to treat every infected patient in the camp. More crates were arriving tomorrow. Weber did calculations in his head. 500 vials of penicillin. If German factories could produce penicillin at this scale, the Wehrmacht would have supplied every field hospital in Europe. But German pharmaceutical production never achieved mass production of penicillin. The Wehrmacht had used penicillin sparingly when available, reserving it for the most critical cases. German doctors knew about penicillin. They understood its effectiveness. They simply lacked sufficient quantities. Morrison explained the supply system. Every American field hospital received regular penicillin shipments. Every aid station had basic supplies. Medical evacuation chains moved wounded from battlefield to hospital within hours. The entire system was designed to ensure wounded soldiers received treatment quickly with adequate medications. Weber asked about manufacturing capacity. How many vials did America produce monthly? Morrison did not know exact numbers, but said production was measured in millions of doses. American pharmaceutical companies had mobilized for mass production in 1943. By 1945, supply exceeded military demand. Civilian hospitals in America were receiving penicillin while military stocks continued growing. The implications were staggering. Germany had discovered penicillin's potential in the 1920s. German scientists had contributed to early research, but German industry never achieved mass production. By 1945, Wehrmacht medical officers were still treating bacterial infections with sulfa drugs when available, or simply hoping patients survived without antibiotics. Weber examined other supply crates. One contained surgical instruments, stainless steel, precisely manufactured, individually wrapped in sterile packaging. Another held plasma for transfusions, whole blood preserved in refrigerated containers. Medical textbooks in English, printed on quality paper with clear illustrations, dental equipment, X-ray supplies, laboratory materials for pathology work. Everything was abundant. Everything was organized. Everything was recent production. The manufacturing dates on various items ranged from January to March 1945. The Americans were producing medical supplies 3 months ago that were now in Bavaria. The logistics chain from American factory to German prisoner of war camp had operated efficiently even while combat operations continued. Morrison asked Weber to identify the most critical patients. Weber led him through the hospital wards. The facilities were primitive, wooden barracks with minimal heating. Patients lay on thin mattresses on wooden bunks. Many were emaciated. The camp's food supplies had been inadequate for months. Rations had declined steadily since January as German logistics collapsed. They stopped at a bed where a French prisoner lay with an infected leg wound. The wound had been untreated for weeks. Infection was spreading. Without antibiotics, amputation would be necessary. With amputation in current conditions without adequate anesthesia or post-operative care, the patient would likely die anyway. Morrison examined the wound and called over an American medic. The medic opened a medical supply pack, cleaned the wound with sterile water, applied sulfa powder, injected penicillin, and dressed the wound with clean bandages. The entire treatment took 15 minutes. Morrison told Weber the patient should receive penicillin injections twice daily for 1 week. The infection would resolve. Amputation would not be necessary. Weber watched the treatment process. The supplies used for one patient, sterile water, sulfa powder, penicillin, bandages, syringes would have been considered a week's worth of critical supplies in Wehrmacht medical practice by late 1944. The Americans had used them for routine wound care on a single patient. The abundance was incomprehensible. The American medics worked through the camp hospital systematically. They evaluated every patient, provided immediate treatment, documented conditions, and established treatment schedules. They worked efficiently without apparent concern about conserving supplies. When bandages were soiled, they discarded them and used new ones. When syringes were used, they were thrown away, not sterilized for reuse. Everything was single-use, disposable, abundant. Weber's assistant, Stabsarzt Klaus Richter, came over. Richter had been a civilian surgeon in Munich before the war. He had worked in Wehrmacht field hospitals in Russia and Italy. He watched the American medics working and told Weber he had never seen medical logistics operate at this scale. The Americans were treating German prisoners with better care and more supplies than Wehrmacht field hospitals could provide for German soldiers. Richter pointed out specific items. The morphine syrettes allowed immediate pain relief without requiring sterile injection preparation. The individual first aid packets meant every soldier carried wound treatment supplies. The plasma containers enabled blood transfusions in field conditions. The penicillin vials represented pharmaceutical production that Germany never achieved. Weber and Richter walked through the supply area examining materials. One crate contained dental supplies, extraction tools, filling materials, anesthetic supplies, examination instruments, complete dental care equipment packaged for field deployment. The Wehrmacht dental service by 1945 consisted mainly of extractions performed without anesthesia when absolutely necessary. Another crate held medical reference books published in 1944, current medical texts, recently printed, distributed to field medical units. The books covered battlefield medicine, tropical diseases, chemical weapons treatment, and psychiatric care. The Americans were providing their medical personnel with current scientific information even during wartime. The surgical supply crate contained instruments that would equip a complete operating theatre: scalpels, forceps, retractors, clamps, sutures, needles. Everything manufactured from stainless steel, precisely made, individually wrapped. The quality exceeded instruments available in many German civilian hospitals before the war. Morrison returned and asked Weber about long-term patient needs. Weber mentioned tuberculosis cases. The camp had 37 confirmed tuberculosis patients with no treatment, available beyond rest and whatever nutrition could be provided. Morrison said streptomycin shipments were expected within the week. American pharmaceutical companies had begun producing streptomycin for tuberculosis treatment. Supply was limited but available for critical cases. Weber knew about streptomycin. German medical journals had reported on its development in 1943. German pharmaceutical companies had attempted production but never achieved viable manufacturing processes. The Americans were already distributing it to field medical units in 1945. The afternoon proceeded with American medical teams establishing full hospital operations. They set up triage areas, created patient wards organized by condition, established a surgical theatre with proper lighting and sterilization equipment, and organized a pharmacy with complete medication stocks. Within 6 hours of liberation, the camp medical facilities had been transformed from a desperate holding area into a functioning hospital. Weber observed everything with professional attention. He was a trained physician. He understood medical practice. What he witnessed was not revolutionary medical technique. The treatments were standard. What was revolutionary was the scale of supply and the efficiency of organization. The Americans had anticipated medical needs and prepared logistics to meet those needs. Every soldier carried first aid supplies. Every medic carried trauma treatment materials. Every aid station had medications. Every field hospital had surgical capabilities. The entire system was designed to move wounded soldiers from battlefield to definitive care within hours, while providing appropriate medical treatment at each stage. That evening, Morrison invited Weber to tour the American field hospital being established outside the camp. They walked through rain to a cluster of large tents. Inside, American medical personnel were establishing a complete hospital. The main tent contained 50 beds with proper mattresses, sheets, and blankets. Adjacent tents housed surgery, laboratory, pharmacy, and administrative areas. The surgical tent contained 2 operating tables with overhead lights, powered by portable generators, anesthesia equipment, sterilization autoclaves, instrument tables, everything needed for major surgery. Morrison explained that this field hospital could perform any surgical procedure except the most complex thoracic or neurosurgical operations. Those cases would be evacuated to hospital ships or base hospitals in England. Weber asked about evacuation procedures. Morrison described the medical evacuation chain. Wounded soldiers received immediate first aid at point of injury. Medics provided stabilization and pain relief. Ambulances transported casualties to battalion aid stations within 30 minutes. Aid stations provided initial treatment and determined evacuation priority. Field hospitals performed surgery and provided definitive care for cases that could return to duty within weeks. More serious casualties were evacuated to general hospitals in rear areas or returned to England or the United States for long-term care. The entire evacuation chain operated continuously. Wounded soldiers moved from battlefield to hospital within hours. Treatment began immediately and continued throughout evacuation. Medications, particularly penicillin and plasma, were available at every stage. The goal was preventing infection and shock while maintaining patient stability during evacuation. Weber compared this with Wehrmacht medical practice. German medical evacuation in 1945 was chaotic when it functioned at all. Wounded often waited hours or days for evacuation. Field hospitals lacked medications and surgical supplies. Hospital trains were targets for Allied air attacks. The entire system had collapsed as German logistics disintegrated. Morrison showed Weber the pharmacy tent. Metal shelving units held organized medication stocks, penicillin, morphine, sulfa drugs, anesthetics, wound care supplies, antimalarials, everything labeled and inventoried. A pharmacist was documenting stock levels and preparing requisition forms for resupply. Weber asked how resupply worked. Morrison explained that field hospitals submitted daily supply reports through medical channels. Supply depots in rear areas maintained stocks and processed requisitions. Transport delivered supplies within 48 hours. If critical shortages occurred, air transport could deliver emergency supplies within hours. The entire logistics system operated parallel to combat supply chains, ensuring medical supplies received priority. The contrast with German medical logistics was absolute. By 1945, Wehrmacht medical supplies depended on whatever could be salvaged or captured. Field hospitals operated with minimal stocks. Medications were exhausted. Supplies were improvised. The system that had functioned adequately in 1939 through 1942 had collapsed completely under the strain of multi-front warfare and Allied strategic bombing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Weber spent the next 3 days working with American medical teams treating camp prisoners. He observed their methods, their supplies, and their organization. He watched American medics treat German prisoners, enemy soldiers, with the same care and abundant supplies they would provide American casualties. The Geneva Convention required appropriate medical care for prisoners of war, but the Americans exceeded minimum requirements. They treated prisoners as patients requiring medical attention, not as enemies receiving minimal humanitarian obligations. One incident particularly affected Weber's understanding. An American medic was treating a German SS soldier with severe pneumonia. The prisoner had been part of camp guard personnel, not a combat soldier, just a man assigned to guard duty. The American medic administered penicillin, provided oxygen therapy, monitored vital signs, and ensured the patient received adequate nutrition and hydration. The treatment was thorough and professional. Weber asked the medic why he provided such careful treatment to an enemy soldier, particularly an SS guard who might have mistreated prisoners. The medic looked confused by the question. He said the patient had pneumonia. The treatment for pneumonia was antibiotics, oxygen, and supportive care. The patient's nationality or unit assignment was irrelevant to medical treatment. He was a sick person requiring care. That response revealed something fundamental about American medical practice. The abundance of supplies enabled doctors to treat all patients appropriately, without rationing care. German military medicine by 1945 had become a matter of triage and conservation. Supplies were insufficient. Medications were scarce. Doctors had to make choices about who received treatment based on available resources. The Americans apparently did not face those constraints. They had sufficient supplies to treat everyone appropriately. Weber examined the penicillin situation specifically. He counted vials being used daily in the camp hospital. American medics were administering approximately 100 injections daily to various patients with infected wounds, pneumonia, or other bacterial infections. At that rate, they were using 700 vials weekly just in this one camp hospital. Morrison confirmed that resupply deliveries arrived weekly with sufficient stock to maintain treatment protocols. 700 vials of penicillin weekly for one camp with 400 patients. Weber calculated implications. If America was supporting field hospitals at this supply rate throughout Europe, they were distributing hundreds of thousands of penicillin doses monthly. The pharmaceutical production capacity required for that distribution was beyond anything German industry had achieved. Weber had access to Wehrmacht medical statistics from before his capture. German pharmaceutical production in 1944 managed limited penicillin manufacturing enough to supply perhaps a dozen field hospitals with restricted use protocols. American production by 1945 was apparently supplying hundreds of field hospitals plus prisoner-of-war camp hospitals with abundant supplies for routine use. Richter joined Weber in the supply tent one evening. They were alone except for an American guard who paid them little attention. Richter had been calculating pharmaceutical production numbers based on what he observed. His estimates suggested American penicillin production exceeded 10 million doses monthly by early 1945. Weber thought that estimate was too conservative. Based on supply abundance at just this one camp hospital, production might exceed 50 million doses monthly. Neither number was verifiable, but both indicated industrial capacity that Germany never possessed. Richter pointed out that penicillin was just one medication. The Americans had comparable supply abundance for morphine, sulfa drugs, anesthetics, antimalarials, and dozens of other pharmaceuticals. Each medication required separate manufacturing facilities, raw materials, quality control, packaging, and distribution. The industrial infrastructure supporting military medical logistics was itself larger than Germany's entire pharmaceutical industry. Weber mentioned something he had noticed. Every medication container bore manufacturing information, company name, facility location, production date, lot number, quality control stamps. He had seen medications from facilities in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois, California. The Americans had pharmaceutical manufacturing distributed across the entire country. No single facility was critical. Bombing one factory would not disrupt supply because dozens of other facilities would continue production. German pharmaceutical production was concentrated in specific regions. The major facilities were in the Rhineland and central Germany. Allied strategic bombing had targeted these areas extensively. By 1944, German pharmaceutical production was severely disrupted. Factories were damaged or destroyed, transportation networks were bombed, raw materials were scarce. The surviving facilities could not meet military medical requirements. Richter raised another point. The Americans were supporting prisoner-of-war camps with the same supply abundance they provided their own forces. That suggested their production so exceeded military requirements that they could afford to supply enemy prisoners without impacting their own troops. German military medicine had never operated with excess capacity. Even in 1939 through 1941, when Germany was winning, medical supplies were calculated carefully. By 1945, supplies were exhausted completely. Weber had served in a Wehrmacht field hospital in Russia during the winter of 1942 and 1943. That winter taught him what inadequate medical logistics meant in practice. The field hospital treated casualties from the fighting around Stalingrad. Wounded soldiers arrived with frostbite, combat injuries, infections, dysentery, and typhus. The hospital had minimal supplies. Morphine was reserved for the most severe cases. Anesthesia for surgery was limited. Many operations were performed with local anesthesia only or with minimal sedation. The wounded who could not be evacuated remained in field hospitals with inadequate care. Infections spread. Wounds that should have healed became gangrenous. Soldiers died from treatable conditions because medications were not available. Weber had watched men die from infections that sulfa drugs would have, controlled or from shock that plasma would have prevented, not because German doctors lacked medical knowledge, but because German logistics could not deliver supplies. By contrast, American wounded in Europe received immediate treatment with abundant supplies. Weber had heard from other German medical officers about American casualty care. American medics carried morphine, bandages, sulfa powder, and plasma. American battalion aid stations had surgical capabilities. American field hospitals performed complex operations with proper anesthesia and post-operative care. American medical evacuation moved wounded from battlefield to hospital within hours. The comparison was not about medical skill. German military physicians were well-trained professionals. Many had extensive clinical experience. German medical education was rigorous. But medical skill meant nothing without supplies. A surgeon could not operate without anesthesia. A physician could not treat infections without antibiotics. A medic could not stop shock without plasma. American military medicine succeeded because American industrial capacity supported it with necessary supplies. Weber and Richter discussed this extensively. Both agreed that German defeat was determined by industrial capacity, not military skill or courage. German soldiers fought effectively throughout the war. German officers made competent tactical decisions. German weapons were often superior in quality to Allied equivalents, but none of that mattered when Germany lacked the industrial capacity to sustain prolonged warfare against enemies with greater production capability. The United States had entered the war in December 1941. By 1943, American industrial production exceeded Axis production across every category: aircraft, tanks, ships, trucks, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. By 1945, the gap had widened to the point where American military forces operated with material abundance while German forces operated with scarcity. Medical supplies exemplified this disparity. American pharmaceutical companies had mobilized for penicillin production in 1943. By 1944, they were producing millions of doses monthly. By 1945, production had increased further, and supply exceeded immediate military requirements. German pharmaceutical industry never achieved mass penicillin production despite understanding its medical value. The difference was not scientific knowledge. German scientists had contributed to early antibiotic research. The difference was industrial capacity and resources. Mass pharmaceutical production required factories, equipment, skilled workers, raw materials, quality control systems, packaging facilities, and distribution networks. It required electrical power, transportation infrastructure, and uninterrupted operations. Germany, by 1944, lacked all of these prerequisites. Allied bombing had destroyed factories and infrastructure. Raw materials were scarce. Skilled workers had been conscripted into military service or killed. The industrial base was collapsing. American industry operated safely 3,000 miles from combat zones. American factories were never bombed. American raw material supplies were secure. American electrical grids functioned continuously. American transportation networks delivered materials efficiently. American industry could mobilize completely for war production without facing the disruption that German industry endured. On April 23, Morrison asked Weber to help document medical conditions in the camp before liberation. This documentation would support war crimes, investigations, and provide evidence of conditions in German prisoner of war camps. Weber agreed to cooperate. He had nothing to hide. The camp medical staff had done their best with inadequate supplies. He would document that honestly. They spent 2 days reviewing medical records and interviewing patients. The records showed systematic supply deterioration from January through April 1945. In January, the camp hospital had limited medications, but could provide basic care. By February, supplies were critically short. By March, almost nothing remained. By April, the hospital was simply housing sick prisoners with no treatment available. The cause was not deliberate neglect. The cause was logistics collapse. German military supply systems had disintegrated completely by early 1945. Wehrmacht combat units were not receiving adequate supplies. Prisoner of war camps received whatever remained after military requirements were met. By April, nothing remained. Weber documented specific cases. A British prisoner who died from pneumonia in March. Treatment would have required antibiotics. None were available. A Soviet prisoner who died from infected wounds in February. Treatment would have required sulfa drugs and proper bandages. The camp had neither. An American prisoner who died from dysentery in January. Treatment would have required rehydration fluids and antimicrobials. Supplies were insufficient. 37 prisoners had died in the camp hospital between January and April, not from deliberate mistreatment, but from lack of medical supplies. Weber documented each case honestly. He explained what treatment was required and what supplies were unavailable. He provided context about German logistics collapse. Morrison accepted the documentation without comment. Weber asked Morrison what would happen to German medical officers after the war. Morrison said that depended on individual cases. Medical officers who had committed war crimes would face prosecution. Medical officers who had simply done their jobs would likely be released after documentation and processing. Weber's record appeared clean. He had treated prisoners appropriately within supply constraints. That evening, Weber sat in the camp hospital watching American medics work. They were preparing medications for evening distribution, penicillin injections for infected patients, morphine for pain cases, sulfa drugs for various conditions, plasma for severe malnutrition cases. Everything was organized, documented, and administered professionally. An American medical orderly was sorting supply requisitions. Weber watched him count penicillin vials, 123 remaining in stock. The orderly noted that more than 200 had been used during the past week. He filled out a requisition form requesting 300 vials for next week's delivery. The requisition process was routine. The supplies would arrive as requested. No questions, no rationing, no concerns about availability. Weber thought about Wehrmacht medical requisitions. By 1944, requisitioning supplies meant submitting forms that were rarely filled. Medications were listed as unavailable. Alternatives were suggested that were also unavailable. Eventually, doctors stopped requisitioning supplies because the process was futile. You worked with whatever you had or improvised alternatives. The American system functioned because industrial capacity supported it. Pharmaceutical companies produced medications in quantities sufficient to meet military requirements. Supply depots maintained stocks adequate for distribution. Transportation networks delivered supplies reliably. The logistics system operated continuously without critical shortages or disruptions. Richter came over with a medical journal, an American medical publication from March 1945. The journal contained articles on recent medical advances, including penicillin treatment protocols, wound management techniques, and psychiatric care for combat stress. The publication date was 6 weeks ago. The Americans were publishing current medical research during wartime and distributing it to field medical units. Weber paged through the journal. The articles were technically sophisticated, assuming readers had access to modern medications and equipment. One article discussed optimal penicillin dosing schedules for various infections. Another covered surgical techniques for thoracic wounds. A third addressed psychiatric treatment approaches for combat neurosis. German medical publications by 1945 were limited. Paper was scarce. Publishing facilities were disrupted. Distribution was impossible. German military physicians had no access to current medical literature. They relied on pre-war training and whatever experience they had accumulated. American military physicians had access to current research, continuing education, and professional development even during combat operations. Richter pointed out another detail. The journal included advertisements from pharmaceutical companies. The advertisements promoted new medications, improved formulations, and enhanced delivery systems. The companies were competing for military contracts by developing better products. The advertisements assumed adequate manufacturing capacity and reliable distribution. They focused on product quality and effectiveness, not availability or cost. German pharmaceutical companies by 1945 were focused on survival. Factories operated at minimal capacity when they operated at all. Production met perhaps 10% of requirements. There was no competition for military contracts because there was barely any production. The industry had collapsed along with the rest of German infrastructure. Weber closed the journal and handed it back to Richter. Everything they observed confirmed the same conclusion. American victory was determined by industrial capacity. Germany had lost the economic war before the military war ended. Once America entered the conflict, German defeat became inevitable. Not immediate, not easy, but inevitable. The mathematical reality was straightforward. America could produce more weapons, more ammunition, more vehicles, more supplies, more everything than Germany could destroy. Eventually, American material superiority would grind German resistance down. The Wehrmacht could win individual battles through tactical skill and soldier courage, but winning battles was insufficient. Germany needed to win the war, and that required resources Germany did not possess. Medical logistics illustrated this disparity clearly. American wounded received immediate treatment with abundant supplies. German wounded received whatever treatment was possible with insufficient resources. American military medicine functioned at high standards throughout the war. German military medicine deteriorated progressively from 1942 onward until it collapsed completely by 1945. Weber had been a military physician for 6 years. He had treated wounded soldiers in Poland, France, Russia, and Germany. He had watched German medical logistics deteriorate year by year. In 1939, supplies were adequate. In 1940 through 1941, supplies were sufficient, though not abundant. In 1942, supplies became scarce. In 1943, supplies were critically short. In 1944, supplies were almost non-existent. In 1945, there were no supplies. The progression reflected Germany's overall economic situation. Germany in 1939 had adequate industrial capacity for short-term warfare. Extended multi-front warfare exhausted German resources. By 1942, shortages appeared. By 1943, shortages became critical. By 1944, the economy was collapsing. By 1945, collapse was complete. American economy showed opposite trends. America in 1941 was just beginning mobilization. By 1942, production was increasing rapidly. By 1943, production exceeded Axis levels. By 1944, American industry was operating at full capacity, producing war materials in quantities Germany could never match. By 1945, American military forces had material abundance, while German forces had nothing. The penicillin situation symbolized this perfectly. One small medical supply item demonstrated the complete disparity between American and German industrial capacity. The Americans produced millions of doses monthly and supplied them abundantly to military medical units. The Germans produced minimal quantities and could not supply field hospitals adequately. But penicillin was not unique. The same pattern appeared across every supply category: ammunition, fuel, food, vehicles, spare parts, clothing, equipment, everything. American forces had abundant supplies. German forces had critical shortages. The disparity determined the war's outcome. On April 27th, American military government officers arrived at the camp. They were documenting conditions and preparing reports on prisoner treatment. Weber was interviewed extensively. The officers asked detailed questions about medical care, supply availability, and patient outcomes. Weber answered honestly. He explained that German medical staff had attempted to provide appropriate care with inadequate supplies. He documented supply shortages and their impact on patient treatment. He described logistics collapse and its consequences for prisoner medical care. He accepted responsibility for outcomes while explaining constraints. The officers seemed satisfied that Weber had not committed war crimes. He had simply been a military physician working under impossible conditions. They documented his statement and told him he would likely be released after processing. He might face additional interviews, but probably not prosecution. That evening, Weber walked through the camp one final time as a German military officer. American forces had transformed the facility completely. Proper housing, adequate food, functioning medical care, organized administration. Prisoners who had been starving in April were gaining weight by late April. Patients who had been dying from untreated infections were recovering. The transformation required just 1 week and demonstrated what adequate resources could accomplish. The prisoners had not changed. The facilities had not changed dramatically. What changed was supply availability. With adequate food, medicine, and care, people recovered. Without adequate supplies, they died. Weber understood that this lesson applied beyond prisoner of war camps. It applied to entire nations. Germany had fought World War II with inadequate resources. The Wehrmacht could achieve tactical victories through skill and courage, but strategic victory required resources Germany lacked: industrial capacity, raw materials, oil, food, manpower. Germany was deficient in all categories. The United States had all those resources in abundance. American industry could outproduce German industry in every category. American agriculture could feed both military and civilian populations adequately. American oil fields could supply military fuel requirements indefinitely. American population could sustain military casualties and maintain production simultaneously. Germany could not compete with that resource advantage. Once America entered the war, German defeat was mathematically certain. The Wehrmacht could delay defeat through tactical skill. German industry could maximize production efficiency. German civilians could accept sacrifice and hardship. None of it mattered because the fundamental resource disparity was too great to overcome. Weber was released from American custody on May 15, 1945. Germany had surrendered on May 8. The war was over. He returned to his family in Munich and eventually resumed civilian medical practice. He never forgot what he observed at Stalag 7A in April 1945. In 1953, Weber wrote a memoir of his wartime medical service. The manuscript was never published, but his family preserved it. The memoir described his experiences in Poland, France, Russia, and prisoner of war camps. One chapter focused specifically on April 1945 and his encounter with American medical logistics. Weber wrote that observing American medical supplies taught him more about why Germany lost the war than any military briefing or strategic analysis. The penicillin vials, morphine syrettes, plasma containers, surgical instruments, and medical textbooks represented industrial capacity that Germany never possessed and by 1945 could never acquire. He described watching American medics treat German prisoners with better care and more abundant supplies than Wehrmacht field hospitals could provide for German soldiers. He explained that this was not American generosity or humanitarian sentiment. This was simply American industrial capacity applied to medical logistics. The Americans had sufficient production to treat everyone appropriately, their own soldiers, Allied forces, and enemy prisoners. Weber concluded his memoir chapter with a reflection. He wrote that German soldiers had fought bravely and German officers had made competent decisions, but bravery and competence could not overcome industrial disparity. Modern warfare required industrial capacity to sustain military operations. Germany lacked that capacity. The United States possessed it in abundance. That disparity determined the war's outcome more decisively than any battle or campaign. The memoir manuscript remained in family archives until 1997, when Weber's grandson donated it to the German Military History Archive in Freiburg. Historians studying German military medicine discovered it during research on Wehrmacht medical logistics. The chapter on American medical supplies at Stalag 7A provided valuable primary source documentation of German medical officers' perspectives on Allied industrial capacity. Academic articles cited Weber's account as evidence of how German medical personnel perceived the industrial gap between Germany and the United States. Weber's observations about penicillin production, medical supply abundance, and logistics organization confirmed what statistical analysis had already demonstrated. American industrial capacity exceeded German capacity across all categories by 1944 and 1945. Other German medical officers recorded similar observations. Generaloberst Siegfried Handloser, chief of Wehrmacht Medical Services, wrote post-war reports for American military intelligence. Handloser documented systematic deterioration of German medical logistics from 1942 through 1945. He described how supply shortages progressively degraded medical care until the system collapsed completely. Handloser's reports included statistical analysis of German pharmaceutical production compared to estimated Allied production. His calculations suggested American pharmaceutical production exceeded German production by factors of 10 to 20, depending on specific medications. Penicillin production showed the greatest disparity. Germany produced minimal quantities, while America produced millions of doses monthly. Handloser concluded that German medical logistics could not sustain prolonged warfare against enemies with superior industrial capacity. The Wehrmacht medical system functioned adequately in short campaigns with pre-positioned supplies. Extended operations exhausted supplies faster than German production could replace them. Multi-front warfare made the situation impossible. Soviet forces imposed massive casualties that required extensive medical care. Western Allied strategic bombing destroyed pharmaceutical factories and transportation networks. Medical supplies could not be produced in sufficient quantities or distributed effectively. By 1944, German military medicine was practicing triage and improvisation. By 1945, the system had failed completely. American military medicine showed opposite trends. Medical logistics improved progressively throughout the war. Supply systems became more efficient. Pharmaceutical production increased. Medical evacuation procedures improved. By 1945, American military medical care exceeded pre-war civilian standards in many areas. Wounded American soldiers received treatment that would have been considered excellent in civilian hospitals before the war. The Penicillin story exemplified American medical achievement. In 1941, penicillin was a laboratory curiosity with limited production. By 1943, American pharmaceutical companies were producing thousands of doses monthly for military trials. By 1944, production reached millions of doses monthly, with routine distribution to field medical units. By 1945, penicillin was standard treatment for bacterial infections throughout American military medicine. That progression demonstrated American industrial capability applied to pharmaceutical production. The same pattern appeared across all medical supplies. Each year, American medical logistics became more capable, more efficient, and more abundant. By war's end, American military medicine operated at unprecedented levels of effectiveness, supported by unmatched industrial production. German medical officers like Weber observed this disparity directly when they encountered American medical facilities. The observations confirmed what many German officers already suspected: Germany had lost the economic war. Industrial capacity determined modern warfare outcomes more decisively than tactical skill or strategic planning. Germany lacked sufficient industrial capacity. The United States possessed overwhelming industrial superiority. That disparity made German defeat inevitable. The lesson extended beyond World War II. Military historians studying logistics and industrial mobilization use Wehrmacht medical logistics as a case study in what happens when military operations exceed industrial capacity. Germany attempted to fight a multi-front industrial war with insufficient resources. The Wehrmacht could achieve tactical victories through skill and courage, but strategic victory required industrial capacity that Germany never possessed. American military historians studied German medical logistics to understand their own advantages. American military medicine succeeded because American industrial capacity supported it with necessary supplies. Medical officers could focus on treatment because logistics personnel ensured adequate supplies were available. The system worked because industrial production, transportation networks, and organizational efficiency all functioned effectively. Modern military medicine applies lessons learned from World War II medical logistics. Supply abundance enables effective medical care. Industrial capacity must support military medical requirements. Logistics systems must deliver supplies reliably to forward medical units. Medical evacuation must move casualties efficiently from battlefield to definitive care. All these principles were demonstrated in American military medicine during World War II. The contrast between German and American military medicine in 1945 illustrated fundamental truths about modern warfare. Industrial capacity matters more than tactical skill. Logistics determines what armies can accomplish. Resource abundance enables sustained operations. Material superiority eventually overwhelms opponents, regardless of their courage or competence. Weber understood these truths when he watched American medics unload supply crates at Stalag 7A in April 1945. The penicillin vials, morphine syrettes, and plasma containers represented more than medical supplies. They represented industrial capacity applied to military logistics, They represented resource abundance that enabled effective medical care. They represented the fundamental economic disparity that determined World War II's outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.